Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting virtual experience with Foss Waterway Seaport and Pretty Gritty Tours. I will be your guide this evening, Chris Staudinger, and we have a very special guest with us. Joining us tonight is the director of the Foss Waterway Seaport, Brent Mason. How are you tonight?
Chris, I am doing great. You know, it was a little bit intimidating seeing you put that lead in into black and white with the creepy music. I thought we were in October instead of December.
Well, you know, this is a project that we've been working on that I have been excited about for years, and you guys giving me the opportunity to bring this to life required a new and poppy intro.
Well, you know, and we had talked before you went live. We had talked about the partnership between the Seaport and Pretty Gritty Tours, and you know, I have to tell the folks that are watching tonight that this is a huge time of the year for the Seaport. We are trying to, you know, we've weathered a pandemic like everybody else has, and we're anxiously awaiting the opportunity to be able to open again, which probably won't come until the springtime. So we've got this humongous goal of trying to raise $50,000 between, really it came starting the end of after Thanksgiving. Through the rest of the year. And so we're hoping maybe your folks might be able to help us out tonight.
Well, they are a history-minded and generous group. So if anyone's going to rally together to support, you know, a community treasure like the Seaport, I think it would be these people.
Well, and I know that they want to get onto the show here. So let me make my pitch, and then you can get people started. Like I said, we have a goal of raising $50,000. We are 60% of the way there. So if my math is correct, that would be about $30,000. We are inviting everybody that is watching tonight live, as well as those that might be watching, you know, a day or two or a week from now, to go to the website that you've posted here below, the fosswaterwayseaport.org/donate, and make a contribution, whatever fits the budget. People need to understand that this $50,000 that we're trying to raise goes for programs and partnerships like the one that we're doing here. Columbia Bank is a big supporter of the free virtual Third Thursdays, but we need a little extra support, need a little extra help. We've already decided to bring you back for 12 months next year. And while I'm sure you would love to work for free, you do have your own you do have your own bills to pay. So I would like to invite people to make whatever their budget allows. I know it's a tough year for a lot of folks, but we've got to be able to stick together, and hopefully we'll pull each other through.
I think that's a very reasonable and compelling plea, honestly, because if 2020 has taught me anything, it's the value of supporting local community organizations and using what limited resources I have right now just to ensure that those institutions can weather this storm, so to speak.
Absolutely. I'm sure this is not unique. Somebody's probably already come up with it, but we need to be looking forward to a happier new year versus just a happy new year, right?
That's actually the first time I've heard it, and I really like it. Well, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Well, and thank you, Chris. And like I said, let's get folks started on the show, and you and I will visit a little bit later on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon.
All right.
So for those of you just joining us now, yes, the Foss Waterway Seaport is not only a hugely beneficial organization to the city of Tacoma and the South Sound region, but they are the reason, in partnership with Columbia Bank, that we've been able to do this series of tours this year. And if you have the opportunity, you can use the link on the screen right there, or the one that we put in the comments, to help contribute to this cause. But let's talk about tonight, shall we? Like I said, this is a story that has captivated me for years. It has been one of the key cornerstones to me launching a tour company here in Tacoma, and it has physically and metaphorically haunted me this entire time. The story of the Andelana is one that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm excited to get to share it with you tonight because she's closer than she's ever been before, I think is the best way to say it. So if you have questions along the way, please let me know in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them. We have a wide range of experts tonight. But if you haven't heard the story of the Andelana, let's first start you with that. So Old Town Tacoma, established in 1850s, 1860s, kind of depending on when you want to talk about true establishment down there, was this boom town in its time. This is what it looked like at sort of the beginning of Old Town becoming a settled area after the tribes in the area got shoved out. And within a couple years, it began to look like this. And it had a reputation for being one of the wildest ports on the West Coast, even more so than San Francisco, because hundreds of these tall ships would come across the Pacific Ocean or from Europe, all across the world, and they would lay anchor out here in Commencement Bay. And from essentially where the Job Car Cabin Museum is, 2 blocks down, today it's 30th Street, there were 13 saloons. And this was like the most dangerous and exciting part of the area. Well before Tacoma as a city like we know it today was established. There was a lumber mill, and so many of these ships from around the world were showing up right down here in Old Town Tacoma. There were a lot of local legends at the time, a lot of fame and glory in Old Town, not the least of which was Rebecca Carr, a woman who had the ability to see the future. And we'll get into her story a little bit more, but she's going to be important to the story of the Andelana as well. Also, I want you to remember Seaman's Rest here. Now, this building still exists. It's a private residence in Old Town today, but this was one of the safe havens down in Old Town, where if you were a sailor that didn't want to just get shivved or catch VD, you could have a safe respite where you could write letters home, actually have a boarding house that was clean, get access to a Bible maybe for the first time ever. This was not a local hotspot, but certainly a safe place in Old Town. The story of the Andelana takes place in this exciting sort of western boom town of Old Town Tacoma. It was a 4-masted, 300-foot ship that had sailed all the way around the world, and in January of 1899, it came to anchor here in Commencement Bay. When it arrived here with a crew of 16, all sailors, including the captain and 2 dogs, were on board the ship in the middle of the night when the ship vanished. No one ever saw it again. It was January 13th, 1899, a Friday the 13th, when the ship vanished. And it was the only thing that anybody knew about it was from a couple things that had floated to the surface, a lifeboat and a few documents. And so they assumed that it had sunk. But there have been over 152 dive or sonar attempts to try and find this ship. And until very recently, almost all of them had been unsuccessful. And the 2 that had been successful ended in fatalities. Now, pictured here is the crew of the Andelana. And what makes this so particularly interesting is a famed maritime photographer, Wilhelm Hester, took this photo the night, literally hours before the Andelana disappeared into Commencement Bay. Pictured right up front there with the round hat and the speckled dog is Captain George Stalling, the 3rd captain of the Andelana, who was in command of the vessel when it vanished into Commencement Bay. To the best of anyone's knowledge, what happened was a large squall whipped up in the middle of the night, tipped the ship over, and it sank almost instantly. It was at the time, and to this day, still considered the largest maritime disaster on Commencement Bay. To give you a little more info on this, we are going to be relying on master diver and famed marine salvage and treasure hunter, Robert Mester. To this day, the ship, with everyone on board, remains at the bottom of our local waterfront. But what could cause a 300-foot ship that had sailed around the world multiple times to disappear in the blink of an eye? For that answer, we ask local marine salvage expert and master diver, Robert Mester.
The Andelana, you can barely see through the fog, a ship at anchor there. That's about where the Andelana came to anchor. It's straight off the corner dock of our facility here in roughly 180 feet of water. You know, it's not unusual weather coming in from the northwest. Commencement Bay is open to the northwest. The wind brings a lot of waves. This ship, it just came in and offloaded all of its cargo, so it had no ballast. They brought along large logs and changed them to the side of the ship in order to help keep the stability. But, you know, Mother Nature, as we all know, sometimes rears its head and does more than what we expect. And that particular night, the wind got so bad, the ship stability wasn't enough. She rolled enough to catch water.
So when the ship vanishes, that alone would be enough to make it an institution of local lore and a popular ghost story, because it was gone in the blink of an eye. No one heard or saw anything. And the ship already had a reputation of being a cursed vessel. When it arrived here in Tacoma, 10 crew members immediately got off board, even without the captain's permission. And they were like, we're absolutely done serving on this vessel. We don't want the curse to get us. And then within 48 hours, the ship vanished to the bottom of Commencement Bay. For me, what really captured my attention is that that was only the beginning of the curse of the Andelana. All these dive attempts have been made to try and find it. And it's massive, right? It's a 300-foot iron-hulled ship at the bottom of Commencement Bay. And while Commencement Bay can get up to 600 feet deep in certain locations, it's not so enormous that you should be able to lose a 300-foot iron-hulled ship. But almost everyone's been unable to find it. 2 attempts stand out in historic records of people who have found it, and both times those divers have almost immediately died. The ship is still down at the bottom of Commencement Bay, and the first time they ever sent someone down to find it was actually an insurance recovery. So the Northern Pacific Railroad had a hard hat diver in the area who was working for the railroad, and they were like, okay, let's go see if we can salvage this vessel, because if they could pull it back up to the surface, they could actually put it back working. So they send this guy down there, and within the day, it results in a fatality.
This is a Morse pump. This is what provide the air at the surface for the divers underwater. And they would pump these cylinders, and the seals are made of leather. That's all they had at that time, to try to form a seal to keep the pressure in the line going down to the diver up against sea level. And the diver that was lost on the Andelana had, unfortunately, one of the seals, one of the 3 pistons there, that failed, and that the diver lost all the air that's under 3 atmospheres of pressure. And the pressure at 180 feet, which is 3 atmospheres, would be 14.7 times 3. And when you suddenly release that pressure to sea level, it causes the face and the ears and skin and everything to get caught into the valve of the incoming air, which, and of course, all the air is removed instantly from the lungs. So you suffocate quick.
Not only the diver that was looking for the ship, but countless sailors that served on board the Andelana lost their lives. But how did it arrive here in Tacoma? That's one of the most interesting parts of this whole thing. The Andelana, like I said earlier, already had a reputation for being cursed. When it first set sail, it found itself in the middle of tragedy. And by the time that it arrives here in Tacoma, it had already had a perilous voyage in which it had lost half of its crew to a variety of disasters. When it first set sail from England, right in 1899, it had a storm rail it almost instantly and crack 2 of its masts. 5 sailors were killed in that storm. So they limped back to England, repaired in the harbor, and set sail again, this time for New York. They reached their destination, but lost 4 more sailors in a storm crossing the Atlantic. From there, they continued their journey around. They ended up in South Africa, where a sickness claimed a few more lives on board the Andelana, around to the coast of Java, where they were attacked by pirates. Continuing up to China, they were hit by a typhoon, which again broke one of their masts and destroyed a great deal of the equipment on board, rendering one of the sailors completely without anything. By the time they arrived in Shanghai, those sailors that had joined in England for the first time ever were now firm believers in the curse. And when they left Shanghai to arrive in Tacoma, it was enough to prompt those 10 sailors to immediately jump overboard and escape into Tacoma, having nothing to do with the ship further at that point. It was this feeling of dread that prompted Captain George Stalling to commission that photograph. It was designed to boost morale of the crew, and thus it became such a definitive photograph because it was the last one ever taken of them. And later, Wilhelm Hester actually felt in some way responsible, so that from then on, anytime he was going to take a picture of a crew, he would always ask someone to step out of the photo because he didn't want to ever take a picture of an entire crew again, thinking that it would end in disaster with them. Now, of the dive attempts, one was successful enough to bring up a piece of the ship. This is a port light from the Andelana, which is now on display at the Washington State History Museum. And I'm going to give that to you with a caveat, because frequently they take it out of the rotation. And I've spoken to security guards who are responsible for this particular collection, and they don't like this particular artifact because they've said that if they're closing up the museum at night, they've said to see what looks like the face of someone drowning on the other side of the glass here. It wasn't just that first diver, though. They got sucked up into the air tube of their dive equipment. But another diver who found it in the 1930s brought up a piece of the ship and then suffered a heart attack not long after. I've also seen a record of a diver who found a piece of the Andelana and was going to bring it back up and sort of spread the story around about having discovered this vessel and then drowned in their bed at night. The autopsy report on them confirmed that both of their lungs had been filled with salt water in the middle of the night. So it's going to just get weirder and weirder from here. The Andelana's location, despite having been found several times by these divers, remains a mystery. People that go to these locations that have been marked on the charts haven't been able to recover it until this year. When I was asking around about the Andelana, the Seaport got really on board with this whole idea. And Julia, who works with the Seaport that you're going to meet here in a little bit, started to ask around in the right locations. And that's when we met Bob Meister. And as a master diver and marine salvage expert in the area and globally, he came forward and was like, you know what? I know where the ship is, but I haven't wanted to say anything about it until now. And I'll let him tell you in his own words.
I've been doing this a long time. I've found many shipwrecks, aircraft, and remains of humans. I've done a lot of work in the water. And I am not the person to go and suddenly make announcements about things unless I have a little bit more information. My belief in what we found is that this is the Andelana. We came across this unusual anomaly that's below the surface of the silt, and the measurement is really what leads me to believe that that's probably the resting area for the Andelana, because the length is 300 feet and the width is the approximate width of the ship. So it can't be positive because I don't have hands on or eyes on, but it fits all the parameters.
Now, Bob is very hesitant to confirm that this is the Andelana, but it is the only thing in Commencement Bay that fits those exact parameters, and nothing else of those dimensions has ever sunk out here in Commencement Bay. To give you guys a little more visual evidence of this entire experience before we launch into the beginning of the curse, here's Bob again.
I believe with this new system, which is more refined, especially in its software application, we were able to see in the translucency of the bottom, the silt, where there might be some outlines of parts of the ship. This particular pass, we hit some targets. It's about the right length, 300 feet in length. And after 4,000 hours behind sonar, I've been able to take a look, and I can see the outlines of a hull of a ship. This is crosstalk. What we're hitting is steel, unlike the rest of the area, and it burns hard. The hit is very hard. It actually goes to the other side of the transducer, and it picks that up as well.
Now, a lot of people think that the tragedy of the Andelana was really just confined to 1899, leaving England, having all of these sailors die, and then arriving in Tacoma to vanish into the night. But the true story of it begins so much earlier than that. The year that the Andelana launched was 1889, and it was instantly riddled with tragedy. The biggest story and headline that you'll find on the Andelana is when it sank here in Tacoma. But after launching as an English vessel, it only made it to Cape Horn. And it was on November 24th that they encountered a storm going around Cape Horn. And the captain at the time had an entirely Japanese crew. The two sailors that went up the rigging to secure a gasket at that time found that the wind was so intense that they couldn't hold it. And one of them, General Sakaturo, fell out of the rigging and landed in the water next to the ship. The captain remembers in his log seeing this sailor fall out of the rigging and land only 20 feet away from the ship, but come back up on the crest of a wave, look directly at the captain, and smile before he disappeared into the water. That event alone was enough to change the life of this captain forevermore. He became deeply superstitious, even more so than a mariner already was from that point forward, and he ends up quitting the service because that single moment haunts him forever. It was the second sailor, though, General Saskaturo, who fell out of the rigging and landed on the deck of the ship, breaking his back. He lingered on board that vessel for over 40 days before he passed away on January 7th, 1891. Or 1892, I'm sorry. When he died on board that vessel, the Japanese crew wanted to hold final rites for him. As is the Shinto tradition, you're supposed to hold final rites the evening that somebody dies, and then 1 year later, 3 years later, 7 years later, and then 33 years later. And the purpose of this, my understanding, is to calm the kami, or the spirit. And that if you don't do this, the spirit of whoever died can become angry and even in some cases vengeful and stick to the area where they died. In the case of someone who dies at sea, they stick to the vessel and become what is called a funiyure, which is a particular type of angry spirit that becomes dedicated to ensuring that everyone who has anything to do with the vessel drowns. The captain at the time denied the Japanese sailors the right to give final rites because he was already feeling panicked about where he was on the ship, and that storm that struck them back in November had actually followed them all the way up the coast of South America, preventing any rapid progress. And so he wanted all hands on deck to make sure that they could continue their journey. This becomes the beginning of the whispers of the funiyure. And so do a Google search on this later. The ghost stories of these angry kami that stick to ships are amazing and eerily similar to the things that happened on the Andelana. In fact, a lot of traditional Japanese sailors will actually carry a bucket with the bottom cut out of it. And the belief is that if these angry kami come to the ship in the middle of the night and try to sink it, that you hand them this bucket with the hole cut out of the bottom, and they will just futilely try to fill up the ship with an empty bucket. Ever since this time, though, after the death of these first two sailors and the denial of final rights, we see a reoccurring trend where anytime a captain takes over the ship, they are plagued with this reoccurring dream that their cabin fills up with water in the middle of the night, and then they're unable to escape. And every time new sailors come on board the vessel for the next 10 years, all of them are struck with either some sort of intense fever or just intense tragedy while they're on the vessel. And it gains a reputation for being cursed. Despite it changing hands 3 times until Captain George Stalling, our final captain, takes command of the vessel, each of the captains in their logs reports having the same reoccurring dream of seeing the cabin fill up in the middle of the night. We know such intimate details of the ship because we have incredibly detailed letters of the people who served on board. And all of those came to us through the dedication and hard work of our very own Julia from the Foss Waterway Seaport. So Thank you for joining us tonight. I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about the letters.
I don't know, Chris. I'm kind of scared of the curse now.
Well, you should be. It has plagued us for
I know.
like 3 months now.
We've been having a lot of trouble with the curse. But yes, so I was researching the Andelana because Chris got me interested in it. Thanks, Chris. And ended up very deep in the internet and discovered that these letters had been obtained by a museum called the Sonneteum in Belgium, which is a curiosity museum. And luckily, I speak a little bit of French, but not very much. And I was able to communicate with the person that runs the Curiosity Museum and ask if we could get copies of the letters. And I was so surprised the next morning when I woke up and there it was in my inbox, about 40 original letters from the ship, 1896, 1899. This one particularly is from Wilhelm Hester, whose photos we display throughout the museum. And if you've been on any of these tours, you've heard of him. And he actually writes a letter to, so these letters come from a person by the name of Richard Hansa. Yes, correct me if I'm wrong there, Chris. Yes, who went down with the ship, but the survivor, and Chris will get more into that later, ended up with his effects. So these things go back to his parents in a sea chest, and the Sonneteum picks up the sea chest in a flea market. And because of the curse and these letters speaking about the curse, they put them into their museum. So this letter is interesting because it's in English and it's a little bit hard to read, but it's Hester, who is staying at the Donnelly Hotel there in Tacoma, and he's writing to Richard Hansa's parents about that photograph that we've always see Chris put in the tours. And he says, but it's interesting because he says he took 2 photos of the crew with your boy in it and also took the ship under full sail. Well, we only have 1 photo of the crew that has ever come to the light, and we've never found the photo of the ship under sail. So I actually reached out to several other museums that have the original glass plates of Hester, trying to put this story together. And I haven't heard back yet because of COVID, but yes, now we're also obsessed with finding these photos. And we're really putting together this whole picture. The letters talk about what they had for Christmas dinner. They're in a mixture of French and English. His mother spoke both languages. So we've been translating some of them. The cursive makes it a little difficult. It's just amazing penmanship. He talks about, this letter is, okay, so they're in Shanghai. You can see it on the top right there, the 6th of November, 1898. And he's writing home to his mother and his grandmother. And then they come from Shanghai to Port Angeles. And that letter is one of the last letters we have before they sank. And he talks about being in Port Angeles and what it was like at the time and going hunting for bears up in the woods on the off season. And also, like Chris has mentioned, there's a lot of really interesting details about the curse. And we all know that sailors are incredibly superstitious. So that's not surprising at all.
With good reason.
Yeah, with good reason. And I'm a sailor myself, so I've been kind of worried. Yeah, a real sea chest. And Bob has some. We are trying to put together an exhibit on this at some point. But I have to go to Brussels to pick up the sea chest. Oh no, how sad for me. So maybe next year. But yeah, so we wanted to also, I just wanted to bring up again that it is our end of the year campaign. And I wanted to just remind everybody, thank you so much for your support so far this year and for tuning into all these programs. And, you know, when you give money to a nonprofit like the Foss Waterway Seaport, you're actually giving to your community, because that money goes right to people like Chris and our community partners. And with the help of the people that have given us grants and our many generous donors, we've been able to do things like send out science kits to the entire 6th grade of the Tacoma Public School. And we're sending out another 2,000 kits to the 5th graders in the spring. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been with us so far. And if you do have anything extra, you know, whether it's $5 or $50 that you can send our way, it really does go a long way for a small museum like us. And we really do appreciate your donations. So happy holidays. And thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you, Julia, for joining us. And thank you for finding the letters. And above all else, thank you for not letting us go out on the water. So, to give you a little more context on this, Julia has really spearheaded this campaign to help discover the Andelana with Bob. And he has offered, Bob, to take us out and do some side scan sonar of the Andelana and help sort of bring more of this to light. And literally every time we've tried to go out, something bad has happened, whether it's been COVID related or an axle has broken or a blood vessel has ruptured. There have been a great deal of signs indicating that no one should go on the water and look for this ship. And while Bob is, I'm going to say, skeptical of it, I'm a firm believer in the curse of this ship. And I'll let him give you the low end before I blow your mind with how dangerous this thing is.
Looking at the Andelana, I did a lot of research into the people, the crew, and it was interesting to find out that a number of the people on the boat had premonitions about being in their room upside down and water rushing in. Pretty bad luck has followed this ship. 2 people died on trying to salvage the vessel, diving on it, and even our efforts to just go out and do a simple sonar side scan pass, we've had troubles with axles breaking and uncooperative weather. I don't really put much belief in bad luck, but there's circumstances behind this that's pretty interesting to look at.
Now, Bob is no slouch. He has recovered several very prominent wrecks in his lifetime, not the least of which was the brother Jonathan. I want to share with you guys some footage right now of the A.J. Fuller, which was a ship almost identical to the Andelana that sank after it was hit by the Mexico Maru in Elliott Bay right off the coast of Seattle. This is from Bob as he was diving on the wreck and recovering crates from the vessel. Now that is stunning footage of the A.J. Fuller, and you would expect something very similar to the Andelana, but part of the secret of why it hasn't been found and recovered lies in where it lies. The area where the Andelana went down isn't the same location where it is today. That first diver who ends up dying very tragically by getting sucked into his helmet after a gasket that he had checked the night before mysteriously ruptures. He manages to hook the vessel up, and using a couple of the tugboats in the area, they drag it 100 feet away from the original location. And that's part of what tipped Bob off, is that going back through the historic records, he knew that the ship was going to be at least 100 feet closer to the shore than the location that it's marked as having gone down. But what the ship encountered there was a level of silt. And the silt in this area, I've been reassured, becomes incredibly liquid during seismic activity. So it doesn't take a large earthquake to reduce that silt into a very easily passed through liquid. Bob will tell you a little bit more about that.
The bottom of Commencement Bay is made of silt. The silt is the accumulation of many things: ash from the mountain over years of volcano activity, the runoff from lakes, runoff from streams, from deforestation, and also pollution from a sarco. And the contents of the submerged portions of this site are actually very toxic. So we can't get down in and do a lot of dredging if we wish to do that, because the release of all these toxins would be very bad for the environment. We're near salmon runs, and there was the major cleanup, one of the largest cleanup sites over on the Foss Waterway, completed, I believe, around 2000. So disturbing the bottom in Commencement Bay is frowned upon on every agency, fisheries, Department of Natural Resources. And so, and the silt is so translucent, it would take a large excavation effort with many, many cubic yards of polluted material to be moved to get down to the site. And you're just not going to get the permission to do that. We've been through that before at another site close to here.
So essentially, the Andelana has been hiding in plain sight. She's so much closer than people ever initially thought, shallower than people thought, but hidden by this layer of toxic silt. Let's go back, though, to Wilhelm Hester. Like I said, he was shaken to his core by this event because he had taken this picture just the night before the ship vanished and felt responsible enough to write this actually touching letter to the Hansa family, talking about wanting to at least provide them with a photograph of their child who disappeared. And for those of you who are curious where the Hotel Donnelly could possibly be, since it's no longer in Tacoma, it was on Pacific Avenue, sort of where the National Bank building is today. And this is what it looked like at the time. But these letters that Julia encountered at the Museum of the Occult are really our window into the true life on board the Andelana. And so much of that comes through the lens of Richard Hansa. So when we look at that final photograph taken at the crew of the Andelana, Richard Hansa is here on the extreme left. And he was so excited to go on this voyage. He had grown up reading these adventure stories of life on the sea. And finally, at the tender age of 17, just turning 18, he embarked on his first commission on board the Andelana and almost had this hero worship for Captain George Stalling. He almost immediately falls ill with an intense fever while they're leaving that port in England for the very first time, and manages to survive that first storm by being down below. And what I think is particularly weird about the account at that time is that George Stalling personally nurses Richard Hansa back to health at this time. They had a connection. And in his log, he says that it sounds like Richard Hansa in his delirium is speaking Japanese, just repeating the same 3 lines over and over again. But Stalling doesn't speak Japanese and has no idea what he's saying. The tragedy of this entire thing continues again and again. As you remember, by the time that they had reached Java, so many people had died on board this vessel that even Richard Hansa, with his hero worship of Captain George Stalling and his intense desire to live an adventurous life at sea, is a firm believer in the cursed nature of this ship. The other person that is a true believer in this is the next youngest sailor on board and now deep, deep best friend of Richard Hansa, Percy Buck, pictured here. Now, Percy Buck and Richard Hansa both believe intensely in the curse, and we know this from the letters that particularly Richard Hansa is sending home. And again, his illustrations and stories of life on board the Andelana give us such a clear picture of what it was like to be one of these sailors, and always is that rhythmic bass line of fear of the curse coming through. And again, this was all found in this sea trunk, which is now in the museum in Europe, along with all the curiosities that he sent home from his singular voyage around the world. We know so much more about this, though, because other accounts, like I said, captain's logs at the time, always report the same thing. And what I think is so fascinating is that all of them continuously reported the same vision of seeing water rushing into the cabin in the middle of the night. And the first two captains on board the Andelana end up quitting because they were fearful of drowning while leading the ship. George Stalling was actually on his way to quit the vessel as well. His final letters home over the last 6 months of his command were written to his wife in Nova Scotia, explaining how this was going to be his final journey at sea, for sure on the Andelana, possibly forever, because he couldn't shake this continuous fear of drowning. We also know something about his temperament, and specifically from the letters sent home from Shanghai, that by the time the sailors had arrived in Shanghai, some of them had already jumped off the ship, and they were afraid that they were going to die on the way to Tacoma, because Captain George Stalling at night was locking them up down below, thinking that he was going to have either a mutiny or a mass exodus on his hands. When the sailors would arrive in a new port, he wouldn't allow them to go ashore. And if they were going to go ashore, they could only be in 2s or 3s. And that if they came back to the ship at night, he would lock them all up on the forefront of the ship. So it's very easy to believe that not only were these sailors confined to the ship, but that when it turned over on that fateful night, January 13th, 1899, that they all would have been locked up down below as well, giving them no opportunity to escape. What's particularly haunting for me about this story is that they're still down there. Based on research from the area and Bob's own private research into the area, and particularly that silt that is hidden in the Andelana, it's easy to believe that organic matter could still be preserved in the ship.
There's been a lot of information about that evening that's come to light actually recently, and it could very well be that most of the crew were kept in an area that was impossible for them to escape when this vessel rolled. When this vessel hit the bottom, it entered into an environment that's full of this silt that we keep talking about. The silt would actually fill the ship's contents, the ship interior, and there probably will be preservation on remains and artifacts that were left on the ship from its rolling and sinking. How long they'll last, I don't know, but we found places around the world where we're finding skeletal remains in salt water back to the late 1700s, depending on the water condition. And that silt is an important part. I've recovered aircraft where the paint number and etchings from the manufacturer, people working on the assembly line, are clear as day to see.
Here's the thing about the Andelana, for those of you who aren't sold on the curse yet. Not only is it a 300-foot iron tomb buried in the silt of Commencement Bay, where everyone who has ever successfully dove on it has died, but when you look back on those records and the letters, particularly of Richard Hansa, they're really lamenting their experience after the pirate attack and the typhoon in Java, in which Percy Buck, his best friend, loses everything. All of his equipment flies overboard, and he's now borrowing clothing from Richard Hansa. And they're so sad about their experience that they get curious about a palm reader in Shanghai. Now, they were allowed to go ashore as a pair, and so they both go, and Richard Hansa gets his fortune told by this Chinese fortune teller. And the guy, based on Richard's letters, is really apprehensive about talking to him because he says that there's this dark, evil spirit following him everywhere that he goes. It's enough detail provided to Richard Hansa that he is convinced to buy a protective talisman. And if you look up here on the documents, this is the talisman. And this was discovered with the letter inside the sea chest that's now in the Museum of the Occult. For a closer look of it here, you can see it's the Big Dipper constellation with 2 crossed swords and then a snake and a turtle. The thing about this talisman that the fortune teller stressed is that it had to be kept on Richard Hansa's person at all times to be effective. But apparently upon taking it, he felt this great sense of relief and calm. And what's very interesting is there was only one survivor from the Andelana. Only one person wasn't on board the ship when it turned turtle that night and disappeared into the bottom of Commencement Bay. And it was supposed to be George Stalling. When they arrived here in Tacoma, they had an invite to go to Seaman's Rest. The woman who ran this, Brigitte Funark, and her daughter Catherine, were immigrants to the area. Brigitte's husband was actually a sea captain who died at sea, and so she wanted to create the safe haven that I told you about earlier, where sailors could find a place to get above the literal violence and corruption of Old Town Tacoma and be safe. And she was personal friends with George Stalling, and she invited him to come up for dinner for the evening and to maybe write a letter home to his wife. And he refused the invitation because he was having this panic dream that he was going to drown on board the Andelana. He also didn't want to leave the crew alone. So that night he locked him up in the cabin of the ship and sent one person ashore to go give his regards at Seaman's Rest. When that sailor arrived at Seaman's Rest, Brigitte Funark instantly flagged him and was like, "You are not going back to the ship tonight. You look awful." And he was like, "Well, I do have a great deal of pain in my mouth." So they sent him to Fannie Mae Paddock Memorial Hospital, which this is what it looked like at the time. It's no longer in Old Town, but it would have been just a few blocks away from Seaman's Rest. He gets there and they treat him for an abscessed tooth, let him stay the night. He's supposed to go back to the ship in the morning. And when he wakes up, the Andelana and the entirety of the crew have vanished to the bottom of Commencement Bay. Now, if you're thinking that that sailor is Richard Hansa, you would be mistaken. It was Percy Buck. Percy was sent ashore that night by luck of the draw, and then finds, as he's putting his gear back on the morning after staying in the hospital, that he puts on his pants, his jacket, and in the pocket of the pants, he finds the talisman. He had been borrowing pants from Richard Hansa just on a whim that night, and finds this protective talisman in there and becomes the sole survivor of the Andelana. And that moment sticks with him for a long period of time. He ends up staying for a period of time here at Seaman's Rest before eventually consulting with Rebecca Carr, the seeress in the area, as to whether or not it's going to be safe for him to travel at sea again. And she has a specific letter talking about this encounter she had with the young sailor, the lone survivor of the Andelana, where, giving him consultation, the thing that he gave her to hold so that she could see for him was this curious Chinese amulet. And that she saw a great deal of darkness always following him wherever he went, but that there was a protective shield around him and that it wouldn't be able to touch him, and he would make it safely home to Europe. Percy Buck ends up on board a ship called the Andrada, owned by the same company that ran the Andelana. And they send him home, and he makes it safely back to Europe, where he gives the letters, the jacket, the pants, and that protective talisman back to the Hansa family, where they put it in the sea trunk because they're not sure what else to do with it. And then eventually, as the years go on, it ends up safely in the hand of this occult museum back in Europe. The Andrada, however, now carries the curse that Percy Buck brought with him, where exactly 1 year later, after he sails with it, it comes back to the Tacoma region, and the Andrada disappears in the middle of the night with 30 plus sailors on board. And the last account we have of it is being in a heavy storm where another captain of a similar vessel sees a light signal in the middle of the night that says, "This is the Andrada in need of help." And they were unable to provide help at that time, and it vanishes into the storm, never recovered. The continuous maritime tragedy that lingers again and again, trailing in the wake of the Andelana, is staggering in and of itself. But now, when you look at it, disappearing out here into Commencement Bay, literally pushing away at every opportunity someone to go and find it, we have deemed it irresponsible to tell you the exact location of the Andelana, simply to say that it has been successfully discovered by very knowledgeable people in the area, but it would be wrong of us to ever mention where specifically it is. If you are interested, however, in looking at a lot of the documentation and the letters, all of that is available online. And like Julia mentioned later, the Seaport is in an active campaign to make this an exhibit so that you can go and see the story of the Andelana from start to finish. I will say from my own personal experience, though, that the Old Town area where all of this has happened still bears markers of it, and that parts of the story still remain. We know for a fact that one of the people who sailed from Shanghai to Tacoma on board the Andelana, a sailor by the name of Robert Murdoch, is listed as having gone mad on the voyage, and the bosun puts him in custody and then places him in the very small jail in Tacoma, where eventually he's released after the Andelana sinks to the bottom of Commencement Bay, and he finds his end right outside the front of the old St. Peter's Church in Old Town there, where he mutilates himself to death. And he is only one of several layers to the story of the Andelana that continue just rippling outward again and again. The only person to have ever come in contact with the vessel and then survived or not just quit the sea life altogether is Percy Buck, the person who carried the talisman actually for the longest period of time. What's just interesting about that is that I've been able to track down 9 of the 10 names of the sailors who got off the Andelana when it arrived here in Tacoma, and all of the 9 that I've found have died in unrelated maritime accidents while serving on different vessels, usually in the Puget Sound, if not on the greater seas. So, for those of you who are at the beginning of this thinking, oh, wouldn't it be cool to go look for at the bottom of Commencement Bay, to go look at things like this underneath the seaport itself, maybe trying to discover the Andelana for yourselves, I would like to urge you very strongly to don't touch it, don't think about it beyond tonight, and leave the Andelana in her surprisingly shallow, dangerously toxic, and closer than you might think grave. To give you some parting words, I'm going to invite our dear friend and truly patron of the evening, giving us the opportunity to tell these fantastic stories of the maritime history, Brent Mason, director of the Foss Waterway Seaport, back into the studio. Brent, welcome back.
I don't know, man.
Don't touch it. It's such a simple formula.
What was funny is the first question I was going to ask you coming out of the green room was like, aren't you just tempted? Aren't you just tempted to go take a look? And no, you're not.
I can say definitively, I am never tempted to touch that ship.
Well, how's this for a segue then? So since you've made such a smart decision to not go in search of this mystery, I think it'd be a good thing if the Seaport kept you around for another 12 months. So how's that sound? And then of course, in doing that, we need the good folks here that are watching tonight to step up and visit the website that we've been posting or you've been posting throughout the evening. And whether it's look at it this way, it's a latte, $5, $10, depending upon where you go for your latte, would go a long way towards helping the Seaport. Julia came on earlier and said that we have an amazing way of taking a small amount of money and making great things out of it. I think the virtual Free Third Thursdays is a prime example of being able to do a ton with a little. And I said it before, and I'll say it again. We look forward to having you back next year. But I'm not sure whether to be excited, creeped out, afraid, or what. I feel like I was a kid when I was going through the haunted house at Disneyland for the first time.
I mean, when you look at all those moments, it does become more than just a coincidence to me, I think.
Do you ever, on any of your any of your ventures, are you ever tempted to look for the forbidden, so to speak?
I think in every adventure, I like to seek the forbidden, and my great passion is being able to bring that to light for people, which is why this has been such a great partnership, being able to bring to light and access so many stories for people. But then there are just some times where you're like, absolutely not, don't touch it. Why would you?
You just got to walk away, right?
Yeah, live to explore another day.
Well, I think the fact that it's buried in toxic silt sort of, I was curious until that part came up, and then it's like, well, no, maybe I don't want to go digging around in that stuff.
I think if anything, it would be great to have someone with the Shinto tradition bring peace to that vessel, because it sank 7 years to the day after those sailors were denied their final rights.
Too many coincidences.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating story. I've been watching the comments come through from the folks that have been watching, and I think they share our creeped outness. And obviously they've been intrigued and fascinated as well. So well done, my friend. Very much appreciated as usual. And again, for those that have been watching tonight or watch tomorrow or a week from now, please help us out. Help us reach our goal of 50,000. We're 60% of the way there, and I know that we'll hit the 50. But at the same time, I would be remiss if I didn't wish everyone a very happy holidays and a happier new year. And Chris, we look forward to seeing you in January.
Thank you very much, Brent. I really appreciate it.
Have a great evening.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes almost our big year. For those of you tuning in for Pretty Gritty Tours, we are going to be hosting the Dickens Festival, a live virtual event this Saturday, 12 p.m. to 2 p.m. That's this coming Saturday. And then we will have one final big event for 2020 called Yule Like Tacoma. You can find all of these on our event page, and we'll be posting them as live events on our YouTube and Facebook channels. But again, thank you so much for coming with us on another exciting journey of exploration. And unlike normal, where I would encourage you to keep on exploring, tonight I'm going to encourage you to sometimes just let it stay at the bottom of the ocean. That's the best advice I've got for you guys. Thank you all so much. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon. Have a fantastic evening. Merry Christmas.